Welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5340 Introduction to Public Policy and Management. This is a part one of extra segment from the readings from section '07, The Origins of Mass Incarceration and Sentencing Reform, focused on articles from the Sentencing Project. Today, we are embarking on a massive, really essential deep dive. We need to look straight into the policy choices that have defined America over the last half century. We're really pinpointing that historical turning point around 1973. That moment, the U.S. began this unprecedented expansion of the criminal justice system. We really need to understand the true scale, the operational failure, and the evidence-based solutions available today.
And we're using the lens provided by the Sentencing Project, which, has been just crucial in documenting this whole history. Their current campaign title is 50 Years in a Wake Up.
Right.
It's a beautifully concise way to put it, really, because that phrase, it was a dual meaning.
Okay, let's unpack that. So the first meaning is that, colloquial term used inside the system, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
For people serving long sentences, saying, I'm doing 20 years and a wake up, it just means you serve the full sentence plus 1 day.
Okay.
That moment you wake up to a new life outside prison walls, it really speaks to the lengthy, often brutal duration of modern American punishment.
And the second meaning, the broader one.
Well, the second meaning is that urgent call directed at the nation. America itself needs to wake up, wake up to the fact that we've relied on this system of mass incarceration that has, frankly, failed to deliver the public safety gains it promised.
Right.
And at the same time, it's created this huge social, racial, and fiscal catastrophe. For anyone studying public policy, the source we're digging into today really prove this wasn't an accident. It's the direct result of specific poor policy choices.
So our mission here is to take these really critical publications from the Sentencing Project and, distill them into actionable knowledge for you, the listener. We're pulling key findings from mass incarceration trends, their detailed analysis on youth justice by the numbers, and that crucial roadmap for the future, ending mass incarceration, safety beyond sentencing.
Yeah, and we'll extract the origins of the crisis, analyze its disproportionate impact, especially when you look at the deep chasms of race and gender disparity, and then, importantly, focus the majority of our time on the evidence-based solutions. Solutions that offer a genuine path toward reducing the scale of the system while, and this is key, simultaneously enhancing public safety.
Okay, let's start where any serious discussion of the U.S. criminal justice system has to start, the raw numbers. Drawing from 50 years of mass incarceration, research and advocacy for reform, the historical context is just, it's staggering. We have to confront the sheer scale of change after 1973.
The change is, mathematically, it's impossible to ignore. The core data point is that the U.S. prison population has grown 500% since 1973.
500%, yeah.
Put that in perspective. In the early 70s, the incarcerated population was around, 360,000 people?
Right.
Today, we're hovering near 2 million individuals held in prisons and local jails. And even when you look globally, the U.S. is still the undisputed world leader in per capita incarceration rates. We far exceed, other industrialized peers and even our closest neighbors like Canada and Mexico.
And for a public policy class, the absolutely crucial finding isn't just the size, right? It's the cause of the size. The common narrative is always, crime rates force the government's hand, but the Sentencing Project consistently refutes that.
Absolutely. The research makes it abundantly clear. The driving force was not some natural or necessary response to crime. In fact, most of the increase in correctional supervision is attributable to, misguided changes in sentencing law and policy. We're talking about the mechanisms created by legislators, promoted by politicians. Things like mandatory minimum sentences, truth in sentencing laws, the erosion of discretionary parole, these policy tools.
Let's break those down a bit because they're key to understanding that 500% growth. How exactly did something like truth in sentencing laws contribute so much?
Well, truth in sentencing laws were incredibly effective at ensuring maximum time served. Historically, prisoners could earn good time credits, which allowed them to be released early based on behavior, participation programs, things like that.
Yeah, it's standard practice.
Yeah. But truth in sentencing, which was often tied to federal funding incentives for states back in the 90s, it mandated that inmates serve a minimum, usually 85% of their sentence, period.
Wow.
So that instantly increased the average length of stay for almost every single person entering the system, regardless of whether crime rates were rising or falling at that moment. It effectively eliminated a key valve for managing the flow of people out of the system.
And when you combine that with mandatory minimums, which, strip judges of their traditional discretion,
Exactly.
you've essentially guaranteed that more people stay locked up for longer, no matter the individual circumstances. I mean, this massive long-term investment in just human confinement, it must carry a cost far beyond the state budget line item. What does the research say about the social fallout?
Well, the fallout is generational. It's structural. Policy students really need to understand this, not just as some unfortunate social damage, but as, frankly, predictable policy outcome. Prior imprisonment creates these huge structural barriers. Declining prospects for employment, often because of occupational licensing restrictions that just bar people with felony convictions from entire professions.
Right.
Consistently lower long-term earnings, profound instability in just basic human needs. We see chronic food insecurity, housing instability because they're often barred from public or subsidized housing, and consequently unnecessary reliance on public assistance just to survive. It's a really effective mechanism for marginalizing millions of people.
And the cost to communities, that sort of subtle erosion of social infrastructure, that seems almost as damaging as the direct economic costs, maybe more so in the long run.
It absolutely destabilizes entire neighborhoods, particularly those already facing economic stress. High incarceration rates lead directly to the dissolution of informal social networks.
Like what specifically?
Well, think about the grandmothers, the community leaders, the local church groups, those informal community organizations that naturally serve as barriers to neighborhood crime. When a large percentage of working-age men and women are constantly cycling in and out of the system, those networks just collapse.
Right.
And this deterioration of trust in law enforcement, combined with that loss of community cohesion, it creates this profoundly cynical and, ironically, less safe environment.
Okay, so given this enormous historical failure, the policy conversation, certainly in recent years, has focused on decarceration. But the Mass Incarceration Trends Report suggests that while we might have peaked in 2009, the pace of decline is still, well, tragically slow.
Yeah, the prison population did peak in 2009.
Yeah.
That was the first real sign that maybe some policymakers were recognizing the diminishing returns of just perpetual growth. But from 2009 to 2021, the average annual pace of decline was just 2.3%.
2.3%.
Right. Now, here's the wake-up math that should, frankly, alarm every policymaker listening. If we continue at this rate, this slow decline that took over a decade just to achieve, it would take 75 years.
75.
75 years until the year 2098 just to get the system back to the 1972 prison population level.
Wow.
75 years just to undo 50 years of failed policy. I mean, that timeline is just, it's unacceptable if you consider the ongoing human and fiscal costs.
That math is definitely a gut punch, but what makes the situation even more urgent, I think, is that alarming reversal that the 2023 report highlighted. After a decade even of slow progress, we actually went backwards.
You did. Yeah. The year 2022 sounded a really clear alarm bell.
Yeah.
It marked the first year in more than a decade when the national prison population actually rose again. It increased by 2%.
And that wasn't just one or two places.
Yeah, no, it wasn't confined to a single area. It was driven by increases in 36 states and the federal government. I mean, look at Mississippi. They alone raised their imprisoned population by a staggering 15% just between 2021 and 2022.
15% in 1 year. As students of policy, we have to ask, what does the Sentencing Project suggest drove this reversal? Was it purely a sudden spike in crime, or was it more of a political shift?
The sources strongly suggest it was more of a political and systemic relapse. Yes, there has been an uptick in certain crime categories, particularly lethal violence since 2020.
Right.
But the primary policy response from several states, like Mississippi, wasn't targeted intervention. It was more of a return to just broad, punitive measures. They often cited things like staffing shortages, court backlogs, pandemic-era temporary releases ending.
Excuses, maybe.
Well, fundamentally, it reflected a policy failure to sustain those decarceration efforts, and maybe an eagerness to return to the political comfort zone of, build more prisons, increase sentence severity. It just demonstrates that the pressure to rely on failed punitive policies remains incredibly potent, and it threatens to stall or even reverse decades of even marginal progress.
Okay, let's shift now. Because the history of mass incarceration, it just cannot be separated from the history of racial inequality in the United States. A central goal of the Sentencing Project's work is documenting how this policy crisis overwhelmingly burdens communities of color. The statistics on racial disparity in the adult system, they remain absolutely shocking.
They really are the moral failure of the system laid bare. We have to internalize that staggering lifetime risk data. 1 in 5 black men born in 2001 is likely to experience imprisonment in their lifetime.
1 in 5.
Yeah. And right now, black adults are incarcerated in state prisons at nearly 5 times the rate of white adults. 5 times. When we zoom out to the entire correctional population, people of color account for nearly 7 in 10 people in prison.
7 in 10. And what's equally critical for policy analysis is understanding how this disparity gets compounded by the length of the sentence itself. It's not just about who gets incarcerated, but who gets sort of forgotten in the system for decades.
This is where that racial chasm truly widens. The longer the sentence, the greater the racial disparity becomes. Black Americans make up 46% of the prison population who have already served at least 10 years.
Almost half.
Almost half.
Yep.
And this demographic overrepresentation spikes even higher when we look at extreme sentences like life without parole, LWOP. That's the most definitive, permanent form of incapacitation the state can impose. Black Americans comprise 55% of the LWOP population.
55%.
Right. This stark data points to systemic bias, not only in determining guilt, but crucially in allocating punitive severity. Who gets the longest, harshest sentences?
And to truly grasp the origins of that severity, particularly around drugs, we really have to pivot to the legislative framework the federal government set up in the mid-'80s. The Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 seem like essential pieces of policy history here.
Oh, they were foundational, absolutely. The Sentencing Reform Act created the U.S. Sentencing Commission and those federal sentencing guidelines, essentially stripping judges of the discretion they once had to tailor sentences based on individual circumstances.
Right.
This move shifted enormous power from the judiciary over to the prosecution.
And then the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 86 weaponized this new framework by imposing those mandatory minimums, creating the notorious crack versus powder cocaine disparity.
Precisely. That was the perfect policy engine for racial disparity. The initial law created that infamous 100-to-1 ratio. It meant the 5-year mandatory minimum trigger required only 5 grams of crack cocaine, a drug historically associated with poor urban black communities. But it required 500 grams of powder cocaine, chemically identical, but often associated with white middle-class users and, importantly, distribution networks.
That ratio wasn't just symbolic, though. It had immediate, measurable policy impact on actual sentencing outcomes. Right?
Oh, absolutely. The data shows direct causality. Before the 1986 Act, the average federal drug sentence for black individuals was already 11% higher than for whites.
Which is bad enough.
Right. But 4 years after the Act passed, once the mandatory minimums were in full effect, that figure skyrocketed. It became 49% higher.
49% higher.
Yeah. This shift just demonstrates so clearly how legislative policy can explicitly and dramatically exacerbate racial inequity in sentencing outcomes, even when the underlying criminal activity may not have proportionally changed that much.
Now, let's move to another key area of disparity, one that's often neglected, I think, in the broader narrative of mass incarceration.
Yeah.
The really intense growth in female incarceration.
This is such a critical point, and the Incarcerated Women and Girls fact sheet really emphasizes it. While the overall numbers of women in prison are still lower than men, the rate of growth is alarming.
How alarming.
The female incarcerated population today stands almost 7 times higher than it did in 1980. 7 times. Furthermore, the rate of growth for female imprisonment since 1980 has been twice as high as that of men.
Twice as high.
Yeah. This suggests that as the whole machinery of mass incarceration expanded, it just swept up women at a faster pace than their male counterparts.
And the policy implications become clearer when you look at why women are being incarcerated. It often reflects vulnerabilities linked to things like poverty, trauma, victimization.
Exactly. The offense profile is crucial for policy formulation. Women are much more likely than men to be incarcerated for nonviolent offenses.
Yeah.
For example, 25% of women in state prisons are there for a drug offense, compared to only 12% of men. Similarly, 19% of women are incarcerated for property crimes versus 13% of men. Many of these women have histories of trauma, abuse, or just sheer financial desperation. Locking them up for nonviolent offenses often means destabilizing their children and communities for crimes that could be much better addressed through social services, mental health care, or anti-poverty measures.
We often hear about declining rates for certain demographics, which sounds like progress, but the data on white women reveals this surprising countertrend that kind of underscores the system's continued expansion.
That is a really important policy nuance we need to grasp. While the rate of imprisonment for Black and Latino women has thankfully declined somewhat since the year 2000.
Okay.
The rate of imprisonment for white women has actually risen by 18% in that same period. Risen by 18%. This shows that while maybe some targeted reforms are mitigating the historical racial bias among women of color, though significant disparity definitely remains, the overall punitive philosophy underpinning the system continues to grow, capturing new demographics and just illustrating the sheer breadth of mass incarceration's reach.
Okay, so if the adult system is largely defined by stagnation, disparity, and structural failure, the youth justice system seems to offer this really indisputable case study in policy success. This is perhaps the most compelling lesson for anyone studying public policy and management, that decarceration can be achieved rapidly and safely.
Oh, the policy success in youth justice is profound. According to Youth Justice by the Numbers, between 2000 and 2022, the number of youth held in juvenile justice facilities fell by 75%.
75%, that's huge.
Huge. We went from over 108,000 youth detained down to just 27,600.
And what's really key here is that this happened despite that massive political pressure cooker of the 1990s, that whole super predator panic that predicted this uncontrollable surge in youth crime.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The super predator theory was a policy disaster fueled by fear. It promoted policies like trying children as adults, increasing punitive measures. I mean, the theory's author, John DiIulio, later publicly apologized for the flawed models that drove it.
Right.
The core lesson, spelled out so clearly in youth justice, lessons from the last 50 years, is just undeniable. The act of locking up fewer kids, diverting them into community-based programs, it did not lead to the predicted crime surge. In fact, youth arrests fell 80% between 2000 and 2020.
Oh.
Moderating the scale of the system actually improved public safety outcomes for youth.
As policy students, though, we need to know how this decline was achieved. What specific policy levers did states actually pull to drive that 75% reduction?
Well, it was a very conscious shift in policy priorities. Key mechanisms included,
Yeah.
first, raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction, which ensured fewer teenagers were immediately transferred into the adult system.
Okay.
Second, dramatically increasing funding and reliance on diversion programs that kept youth out of formal court processing altogether. And third, closing those outdated, often geographically isolated youth facilities and reinvesting those funds into high-quality, community-based residential and treatment programs closer to the youth's families. The policy goal really became treatment, not just punishment. That's a key management distinction from the adult system.
Okay, so the overall numbers are way down, which is fantastic. But we have to ask, were the deep racial disparities that plague the adult system, were they solved in the youth system's success story?
Unfortunately, no. That's the really troubling part. The overall system shrank dramatically, but deep racial disparities persist in who gets targeted for incarceration versus who gets treatment.
How bad is it?
Black youth are placed in facilities at a rate of 228 per 100,000. That is 4.7 times higher than white youth.
Wow.
And tribal youth also face extreme disproportion. They're incarcerated 3.7 times as often as white youth.
And these disparities are evident really early on, right? Long before sentencing. It's about those discretionary policy choices made by police, by court intake officials.
This is such a crucial policy insight. Look at the treatment disparity. Black youth are 60% more likely to be detained and 63% more likely to be committed to placement than white youth referred to juvenile court.
63% more likely.
Right. Now contrast that with the policy outcome for white youth. They are 31% more likely to have their cases diverted from formal processing entirely. So when discretionary power is involved, systemic bias just consistently shifts the outcome toward formal criminalization for youth of color and toward therapeutic alternatives for white youth.
What specific nuances do the sources highlight when analyzing girls in the system? Because their experiences can be quite different.
Yeah, girls make up about 14% of the total youth in residential placement. But the data reveals these specific criminalization patterns that really require distinct policy solutions. For instance, Native American girls have the highest incarceration rate of all groups, over 4 times the rate of white girls.
4 times.
Yeah. Furthermore, girls comprise a disproportionately high percentage of youth incarcerated for status offenses.
Yeah.
Those are the low-level behaviors that are only crimes because the person is a minor, like truancy or curfew violations.
Right.
37% of youth in placement for status offenses are girls. It suggests they're often being criminalized for behaviors that are frequently linked to family instability or underlying trauma, things that need support, not incarceration.
Okay, before we transition to solutions, we absolutely must address the clear warning sign that this successful trajectory in youth justice is now facing a really severe threat.
Yeah, youth justice by the numbers highlights a deeply disturbing reversal in one of the most punitive practices, transferring youth to adult facilities. The number of youth held in adult prisons jumped 50% between 2021 and 2022.
50% jump.
50%. Reversing a 25-year decline in this population, this is a massive failure of policy management. Sending 13 to 17-year-olds into adult prisons, it guarantees heightened risk of physical and sexual abuse, and it significantly increases their future recidivism rates. This policy U-turn threatens to undermine the entire 75% reduction achieved over 2 decades. It demands immediate attention from public policy leaders.
That alarming trend reversal really highlights the urgency of this next section. If mass incarceration demonstrably fails to deliver public safety, what is the policy alternative? The Sentencing Project's report, Ending Mass Incarceration, Safety Beyond Sentencing, provides this really comprehensive evidence-based roadmap. It's built on 5 core pillars.
Right, and this section is where the real management challenge lies. We've defined the crisis, now we have to define the corrective action. It means shifting resources away from the expensive, inefficient criminal legal system and toward community investments that address the true root causes of crime.
Okay, let's start with the first pillar. Implementing community safety solutions that don't rely on police or prisons. This includes something called the greening effect.
Yes, the greening effect is a fascinating policy insight. Initiatives like improving street lighting, cleaning up vacant lots, funding green spaces, these things are actually shown to reduce violence.
But why? How does cleaning a lot stop violence?
Well, it's often psychological. These actions signal to residents that the community is cared for, which raises the level of what sociologists call collective efficacy.
Collective efficacy.
Yeah, it's the shared belief among residents that they can and will intervene for the common good. A cleaned-up lot is just less attractive for illicit activity than an abandoned one.
It makes sense.
And the resulting community cohesion acts as a kind of natural deterrent.
And the most direct community intervention model detailed in the sources focuses on violence interruption. How does that work?
This is a true public health approach. Models like Cure Violence use trained individuals, often called credible messengers, people who have lived experience with the violence they're trying to stop.
Great.
To identify high-risk individuals and intervene in conflicts before they turn lethal. Similarly, hospital-based violence prevention programs, HVIPs, use the immediate aftermath of an injury, that moment when a victim might be most open to change, as a moment of intervention. They offer trauma counseling, case management, all to prevent the cycle of retaliation.
The core philosophy seems captured in that powerful quote from Dr. John Rich. Rather than asking, what's wrong with you, we should ask, what happened to you? But my policy question is about scale. You contrast the $129 billion spent by state and local governments on policing in 2020 versus landmark federal funding of only $250 million for violence prevention through the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Isn't that federal commitment just, too small to really matter?
That is the management challenge we face. The investment gap is enormous, and it really demonstrates a political failure to prioritize prevention based on evidence. For these proven models like Cure Violence and HVIPs to truly succeed and actually supplant the need for mass incarceration, they have to be funded at a scale comparable to policing, or at least, in the billions of dollars, to achieve saturation in the communities that need them most.
Right.
The Sentencing Project argues we have to restructure public safety budgets to reflect the evidence, not just historical political inertia.
Okay, moving to the second pillar, transforming crisis response. This is about moving away from using police as the default responders for basically non-criminal problems.
Exactly. This recognizes a fundamental inefficiency. Police are highly trained, they're expensive resources, yet they spend a huge amount of their time responding to situations they frankly aren't trained for: mental health crises, substance use emergencies, issues stemming from lack of housing.
And that often leads to bad outcomes.
It often results in unnecessary arrests and escalates trauma. Definitely. The solution is creating alternative, non-police response systems.
The leading example cited is Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon. What's the operational mechanism there? How does it work on the street?
So Cahoots Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets, it's a mobile, unarmed, non-police response system. The teams consist of 2 people: a trained crisis worker, often specializing in mental health and de-escalation, and a medic.
Okay.
In 2019, they responded to roughly 24,000 calls. And here's the key performance indicator. They resolved almost 20% of all calls received by the city's 911 system, with only about 300 of those calls requiring any police involvement at all.
20% of all calls handled without police. That is a staggering reduction in police contact. What does the policy outcome look like when systems like this are implemented more comprehensively across the city?
Well, when a city like Tucson implements a comprehensive crisis response system, you see these dramatic, targeted declines in arrests for specific low-level offenses that just clutter the system. Things like vagrancy, civil disturbance, drinking in public.
Right.
It saves time, it saves money, it saves lives, and it ensures that vulnerable individuals actually receive treatment, not incarceration. It's just a pure policy win-win.
The third pillar focuses on reducing unnecessary justice involvement through things like decriminalization and diversion. This really means stopping the criminalization of poverty, doesn't it?
Precisely. We need to safely decriminalize non-public safety offenses that are often associated with poverty, like loitering or various quality of life offenses. Furthermore, even for minor offenses that might remain criminal, robust diversion programs are absolutely essential. The goal is to maximize accountability while minimizing contact with the formal system, because we know that contact itself is stigmatizing and actually increases future crime risk.
Do we have solid data supporting the idea that not prosecuting misdemeanors is actually effective? It sounds counterintuitive to some.
We have compelling evidence. A study looking at non-prosecution of misdemeanors in Boston found a significant and positive result. Those whose cases were non-prosecuted saw a 53% reduction in the likelihood of getting a new criminal complaint over the next 2 years compared to similar people processed through the traditional system.
53% reduction, so leniency worked better.
It proves that leniency, when coupled with appropriate resources, can actually be safer than punishment in many cases.
And for more serious offenses, diversion often takes the form of restorative justice, or RJ. What makes that model so effective, particularly for young people?
Restorative justice fundamentally shifts the focus from just punishment to actually repairing the harm caused. Alameda County's pre-charge RJ diversion model for youth is a great example. It brings the victim and the person who caused harm together, often with trained facilitators, to agree on how to hold the offender accountable and make amends.
And does it work?
The study found that participants were 44% less likely to recidivate than similarly situated youth who went through the traditional youth justice system. RJ teaches accountability and empathy, things traditional incarceration rarely, if ever, achieves.
Pillar 4 directly confronts the disastrous legacy of the drug war, which we discussed earlier as a major engine of disparity.
Yes, the drug war was a primary engine of mass incarceration. The solution here is clear. We must shift entirely toward a public health model for substance use. This means prioritizing robust, immediate access to evidence-based services like methadone maintenance treatment, which is proven to reduce criminal behaviors and fatal overdoses among people with opioid use disorder. Criminalization only creates barriers to getting that vital treatment.
And globally, Portugal provides the sort of gold standard for this policy shift, right?
It really does. Portugal implemented a national strategy back in 2001 that decriminalized the possession of all drugs for personal use. Instead, they channeled individuals toward treatment panels and health services, not the criminal legal system.
And the outcome?
The outcome was a significant decrease in fatal overdoses, HIV infections related to drug use, and importantly, no measurable increase in drug use compared to neighboring countries that kept criminalizing. The policy takeaway is just irrefutable. Criminalization harms public health and fails public safety. Public health responses improve both.
Okay, finally, the fifth pillar addresses strengthening opportunities for youth, really focusing on prevention and early childhood investment. These often yield the highest fiscal returns, don't they?
Absolutely. Investing early is probably the highest yield public safety strategy we have, period. For example, the Nurse Family Partnership, NFP, provides sustained home visitation for first-time low-income mothers. This early support reduces rates of child abuse and neglect, and it leads to lower arrest rates for both the children and the mothers years down the line.
Wow.
Then, of course, there's early childhood education. The famous High Scope Perry Preschool Project really shows the lifetime impact.
The cost-benefit analysis of the Perry program is often cited. What are the specific policy savings that lead to that amazing $7.06 return for every dollar invested? It sounds almost too good to be true.
Well, that return isn't speculative. It's based on quantifiable policy savings tracked over decades. The cost-benefit analysis breaks down where the savings accrue. Reduced need for special education services later on, increased high school graduation rates, which lead to higher lifetime earnings and thus higher tax contributions. And crucially, substantial savings in criminal justice costs because the participants were far less likely to be arrested later in life. This really moves the argument beyond just morality to straightforward fiscal responsibility.
What about interventions for older youth, those who are maybe already at risk? Is it too late then?
No, not at all. Those work too, especially programs focusing on mentorship and cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Programs like Match in Chicago, which provide intensive tutoring and mentoring, show that participating students were 60% less likely to be arrested for a violent crime. Yeah. And the Becoming a Man, or BAM program, also in Chicago, it focuses on social skills and managing impulsive behavior through CBT. It achieved a reduction in violent crime arrests of 45–50% and increased high school graduation rates. These interventions prove that opportunity and targeted behavioral health investment dramatically reduce future system involvement, even for older kids.
All right, our final policy discussion today focuses on a consequence of mass incarceration that extends long, long after time is served: the systematic denial of civic identity through felony disenfranchisement. This is detailed in the Sentencing Project brief, Increasing Public Safety by Restoring Voting Rights.
Yes, and this is such a critical discussion about democracy itself, about citizenship. Over 4.4 million Americans cannot vote today due to a felony conviction. But what's most shocking, I think, for policy analysis is the status of these individuals.
What do you mean?
76%, more than three-quarters of these disenfranchised Americans, are already living, working, and paying taxes right in their communities. They're on parole, probation, or they've fully completed their sentences. Yet they remain excluded despite having, by law, repaid their debt to society.
And like pretty much every facet of mass incarceration we've discussed, this policy is fundamentally linked to racial disparity.
Oh, absolutely. The policy acts as a structural barrier to racial justice. Because of the high rates of incarceration we talked about earlier, 1 in 19 voting-eligible Black Americans is banned from the ballot box. That compares to about 1.9% of the overall adult population. This denial of basic civic rights just perpetuates the historical marginalization of Black communities and dilutes their political power.
What's most compelling, though, especially for our audience, the policy students, is the counterintuitive evidence presented. The Sentencing Project argues that restoring the right to vote is itself a public safety strategy. How can that be?
Yeah, this completely flips the punitive narrative, doesn't it? We traditionally think of disenfranchisement as just an added punishment, but the research strongly suggests it's actually counterproductive to successful reintegration. A key study found that individuals released from prison in states with automatic voting rights restoration were approximately 10% less likely to be rearrested compared to those released in states with permanent disenfranchisement laws.
10% less likely to be rearrested just by getting the right to vote back.
The data suggests yes. It indicates that the act of restoration itself actually makes communities safer.
Let's delve deeper into the psychological mechanism there. Why would the simple act of voting, or even just having the right to vote, have such a measurable effect on recidivism?
Well, it connects back to this concept of developing a pro-social identity and building civic capacity. When an individual has been stigmatized by the criminal justice system, successful reintegration really depends on them developing an identity as a law-abiding, contributing member of society. Being given the right to vote reinforces this positive, pro-social identity. The right to vote is just a fundamental component of full citizenship. When people are permanently banned from voting, it creates what former inmates often describe as a feeling of being a partial citizen.
That feeling of being a partial citizen, that must profoundly impede successful reintegration psychologically.
It really does. It reinforces the stigma, the sense of exclusion, making it harder to feel invested in community norms or to follow the rule of law consistently. Restoring the vote sends a clear policy message. Your participation is valued, you are fully reintegrated. This civic inclusion helps cement the intention to remain crime-free.
But despite this really overwhelming evidence that restoration actually aids public safety, serious obstacles persist, particularly for people with specific types of convictions.
Yes. Many states, including places like Alabama, Florida, Delaware, they utilize these really onerous carve-outs. They exclude individuals convicted of certain offenses, often murder, sexual offenses, or sometimes vague terms like crimes of moral turpitude from the typical restoration processes. This leaves them entirely reliant on getting a gubernatorial pardon.
And what does that pardon process actually entail in practice? I mean, is it a realistic avenue for restoration for most people?
Honestly, it's a nearly insurmountable obstacle in most cases, often seemingly designed for bureaucratic failure. In places like Delaware, the requirements are just intense. Submitting certified criminal history from multiple states, sometimes submitting to a mental health exam, providing detailed financial records, navigating multi-year waiting periods after the sentence is already completed. And because governors tend to issue pardons very sparingly, often only in high-profile or politically expedient cases, this policy structure ensures that thousands of individuals who may have lived crime-free for decades remain permanently disenfranchised. It runs directly contrary to the public safety evidence we just discussed. So let's kind of return to where we started this deep dive. The origins of the mass incarceration crisis were rooted in very specific policy decisions, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing made in a politically charged climate, often focused on fear, not data.
Right.
The resulting reliance on extreme punishment, evidenced by that staggering 500% growth since 1973, is what created the crisis. It wasn't some inherent need for mass punishment based on crime rates.
And we now have these two really contrasting policy models right in front of us. We have the youth justice system, which successfully used policy reform to shrink its size by 75% while simultaneously making communities safer. That's a concrete proof of concept right there.
Exactly.
Versus the adult system, which is barely declining at that glacial 2.3% annual rate and, alarmingly, even showed a reversal in 2022.
And the current moment, with the unfortunate real uptick in lethal violence since 2020, that's a serious point of vulnerability. Policymakers absolutely must resist the historical emotional pull to just return to failed policies like building more prisons or expanding sentences. The data demands that we accelerate investment in the evidence-based alternatives we discussed today.
Things like community violence interruption.
Transformative crisis response, therapeutic support for youth. We need to invest in those now, rather than waiting until, 2098 to fix a problem we already know how to solve.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the student of public policy, to mull over. The Sentencing Project notes that the total population serving life sentences, including life without parole, in the year 2020 actually exceeded the total prison population of the entire country back in 1970.
Just let that sink in.
Yeah.
And remember, research consistently shows that most criminal careers are relatively short, typically spanning around 10 years. So we have hundreds of thousands of individuals serving these decades-long sentences far, far beyond the point of any diminishing returns for public safety.
So the challenge for you is this. How can the U.S. successfully overcome the inevitable political resistance and accelerate necessary second-look policies? These are mechanisms for meaningful, retroactive sentence review for people serving those decades-long sentences. How do we do that to prevent the next 50 years from mirroring the painful, expensive, and racially unjust past? We absolutely must find the policy levers to accelerate justice and finally align the scale of our criminal justice system with the actual evidence of criminal risk.